Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome back to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
And didn't we pick the right fortnight to take a holiday, Chaz?
Nothing happened.
We'll catch you up on the latest developments following the release of the Mueller report.
And there is a lot happening on the campaign trail. Joe Biden is officially in the race and Bernie is slipping down the polls.
And in the history department this week, bad news for Biden. VPs do not have a great record in getting to the top job.
Good news, he's winning by about 50 points. That and more coming up. But first, news time.
There is growing criticism of US Attorney General Bill Barr's handling of the release of the Mueller report, and among his critics, Robert Mueller himself. A March 27th letter from Mueller to Barr complaining about the AG's 4-page summation of the special counsel's report was leaked to the Washington Post this week. Mueller wrote Barr's memo of March 24th, quote, did not fully capture the context, nature and substance of Mueller's work. Appearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee this week, Barr said that he had phoned Mueller after receiving the letter.
I said, Bob, what's with the letter? You know, why don't you just pick up the phone and call me if there's an issue?
And Barr says in an earlier and as yet unleaked letter on March 25, Mueller asked him to release the redacted summaries contained in the report to give people a more balanced view of the special counsel's work.
I suggested that I would rather just get the whole report out than just putting out stuff seriatim and piecemeal.
And so, for 25 days, we only had the Barr memo to Congress to characterise the Mueller report. Barr maintains Mueller was mostly concerned, though, about the media's characterisation of the memo, not Barr's summation itself, although we will have to wait for Mueller's likely congressional testimony to find out if that is an accurate claim. Barr, meanwhile, admitted under questioning in the Senate this week Mueller's letter was also critical of him, but he then questioned who actually wrote that.
The letter's a bit snitty, and I think it was probably written by one of his staff people.
So we'll just have to wait and see just how snitty Bob Mueller really is with the way that Bill Barr has been characterising his findings, Chaz.
Of course, the easy way to tell what happened during that phone call would be if someone took notes of the conversation. Enter Richard Blumenthal.
Did anyone, either you or anyone on your staff, memorialize your conversation with Robert Mueller?
Yes.
Who did that?
There were notes taken of the call.
May we have those notes?
No.
Why not?
Why should you have them?
What?
Why should you?
And if that wasn't shifty enough, check out how Barr refers to the White House waiving executive privilege claims.
Exerted executive privilege.
Excuse me?
We may have already waived his.
No, we haven't waived executive privilege.
No, you're not supposed to be part of the we, Bill Barr. You're representing America, not the White House. I've got a lot more to say about this guy in the extra, John, so have a look here.
Meanwhile, Democrats are pretty snitty with Bill Barr after he refused to appear before the House Judiciary Committee this week. Barr objected to their plan to have lawyers question him for up to 30 minutes at a time, rather than the usual 5 minutes per member of Congress. Top Democrats, including Kamala Harris and Mazie Hirono, are calling for Barr to resign. House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler is threatening to charge Barr with contempt if he doesn't hand over an unredacted Mueller report this week.
The Attorney General has a nerve to try to dictate, and the administration has a nerve to dictate our procedures. It's simply part of the administration's complete stonewalling of Congress.
And Mueller is now reportedly negotiating his appearance directly with Democrats, cutting Barr right out of the loop. Potentially another sign the special counsel and the AG are not seeing eye to eye. There are lots of legal questions surrounding Bill Barr, Robert Mueller, the role of Congress, and the lingering possibility of impeachment proceedings. But before we look at that, let's try and get our heads around the Mueller report itself.
Break it down.
The Mueller report was finally released by Attorney General Bill Barr on the Thursday before Good Friday, or rather 92.75% of it was released, the rest redacted, mostly because of ongoing matters, particularly, it seems, the Roger Stone WikiLeaks Russian hacking stuff. This was President Trump's first response.
No collusion, no obstruction. I'm happy with that.
But it is not nearly that cut and dried, particularly on the question of obstruction, as we'll see. But first, to the good news for the president.
Investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities.
Mueller found the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in a, quote, sweeping and systematic fashion, hacking DNC emails, releasing them through WikiLeaks and spreading disinformation on social media. Mueller also found that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome. That the Trump campaign expected it would benefit electorally from Russian efforts, but crucially, Mueller did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. So, Russia wanted Trump to win and did a lot to help him. Trump's campaign thought the Russian interference would help them, but Mueller couldn't prove they were in it together. Common cause, but no conspiracy. And of course, Chaz, remember that this was an election that Trump won by a total of just 78,000 votes in 3 swing states.
Yep. My turn. Okay. Well, John, I can go even further than that, at least for Russia's social media campaign. Now, you might recall the Internet Research Agency, or as I call them, the Fun IRA. These were the wacky guys whose memes like these reached 126 million people, according to Facebook. But according to Mueller, his investigation did not identify any evidence that any Americans conspired or coordinated with these wacky funsters. That is conclusive. Certainly more conclusive than Mueller's findings were on conspiring with email hackers. Mueller said that Trump repeatedly asked his campaign to find Hillary Clinton's 30,000 deleted emails somehow, and that Michael Flynn asked some guy called Peter Smith to help out. Then the Smith character claimed to some buddies that he was in contact with hackers who had ties to Russia. He also told his friends that he was coordinating with the Trump campaign. So that's all a little bit murky, but it couldn't be verified. So no indictment. But that doesn't necessarily mean no collusion. Mueller was very clear on this one. Collusion is not a specific offence or a term in the federal criminal law. So Mueller was trying to prove conspiracy, not collusion. Or in other words, as Rudy Giuliani said last year,
Collusion is not a crime.
spot on, Rudy! But conspiracy is a crime, and Mueller found a lot of potential conspiring. These are all the links that Mueller noted between the Trump campaign and Russia, 127 of them. In some of those links, Russia offered to assist the campaign. And in some of those links, the campaign was receptive to the offer. So why no conspiracy? Well, Mueller said that meetings don't matter, and neither do shared interests. What conspiracy requires is a tacit or express agreement of some kind between the Trump campaign and the Russian government about election interference. And the evidence did not establish that an agreement was made. So, not guilty. John.
The special counsel's report detailed lots of contacts between the Trump campaign and Russians that we already knew about. Manafort giving polling data to Konstantin Kilimnik, who was considered by Manafort's partner Rick Gates to be a Kremlin spy. Mueller basically said he couldn't be sure what that was really about. And then in particular, what really went on at that June 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Don Jr., Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort, with Russians including Kremlin-linked lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was offering dirt on Hillary Clinton. Mueller says Veselnitskaya claimed that funds derived from illegal activities in Russia were provided to Hillary Clinton and other Democrats. Don Jr. was all ears, but she changed the topic to sanctions under the Magnitsky Act and never produced any information on dirty money contributions. Jr. said they could look at the issue after the election. She contacted the Trump transition team, but they, quote, did not engage. So, no conspiracy there. And this is how Don Jr. famously summed up that meeting when news about it broke in 2017.
It was such a nothing. I literally wouldn't have remembered the meeting.
So in his conclusion in that first section, Mueller says, quote, schemes involving the solicitation or receipt of assistance from foreign sources raise difficult statutory and constitutional questions. Mueller says, quote, a prosecution would encounter difficulties proving that campaign officials willfully violated the law. So, Basically, Mueller considered charging Don Jr. and the others at that June 2016 meeting under campaign finance law, dirt on Hillary Clinton being an illegal contribution. But whereas in most cases ignorance of the law is no defence, ignorance of campaign finance law, like some tax laws, is a defence. Because Don Jr. and others could have argued they didn't realise the offer of dirt was a thing of value under the law, so it just wasn't worth charging them. Cheers.
And John, this is where we run into the limits of the investigation. Because if you want to know what Don Jr. understood about campaign finance law, you need to ask him. But Don Jr. declined to be voluntarily interviewed by Mueller, that's his right. Okay, and Mueller could have subpoenaed him if he wanted to, although there is some speculation that Mueller was a little worried about setting Daddy Trump off. Who knows? Either way, it wasn't ideal. And neither was it ideal that Daddy Trump refused to provide answers to any questions about obstruction. And the questions that he did answer about collusion, he answered on paper, and he stated on more than 30 occasions that he didn't recall things. So Mueller asked him again for an in-person interview so they could ask some follow-up questions, and Trump declined, which was his right to do, and they could have subpoenaed him. But for some reason, they didn't. I wonder why. Anyway, meanwhile, Mueller openly stated that the evidence suggested that the president intended Manafort to believe that he could receive a pardon, which would make Manafort less likely to cooperate with the investigation, of course. So I don't know so much about this.
The White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation.
Bad Barr. It wasn't just the Trumps playing hard to get. Mueller noted that several people affiliated with the Trump campaign lied about interactions with Russian-affiliated people, and some deleted relevant communications, and some used apps that didn't allow their communications to be stored long-term. And Mueller couldn't rule out the possibility that that missing info might have shed extra light on the events in the report. Now, some people will not like that much, but that is how criminal investigations work. You gather as much evidence as you can, and if there isn't enough, you give the defendants the benefit of the doubt. So, not guilty, John.
And finally, let's take a look at obstruction.
No obstruction.
Well, that's what he says, but it is not what Mueller says. The special counsel report details numerous attempts by the president to shut down the Russia probe, which could amount to obstruction of justice or the basis for possible articles of impeachment. First, sacking FBI Director Jim Comey after he refused to pledge a loyalty oath, dropped the investigation into sacked National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and publicly declared Trump himself wasn't under investigation. Then, asking former advisor Corey Lewandowski to give Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who had recused himself from oversight of the Russia probe, a message that Sessions should announce the investigation was, quote, very unfair to the president, and that the president had done nothing wrong, and that Sessions should instruct Mueller to stop investigating the 2016 election and instead focus on election meddling for future elections. And then there was the time that President Trump told White House counsel Don McGahn to sack Mueller.
Fake news, folks. Fake news.
Not so fake, as it turns out. Mueller says Trump told McGahn to deny the story, and McGahn refused. Trump then asked McGahn to create an internal memo denying the story. Mueller writes, in urging McGahn to dispute he was ordered to have Mueller terminated, the president was influencing McGahn's account to deflect or prevent scrutiny of the president's conduct. Some legal observers, like Lawfare's Ben Wittis, say that and other examples leaves him with little doubt the president engaged in criminal obstruction of justice on a number of occasions. And it's not just Ben Wittis. How about Fox News legal analyst Andrew Napolitano?
When the president asked Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager, to get Mueller fired, that's obstruction of justice. When the president asked his then White House counsel to get Mueller fired and then lie about it, that's obstruction of justice. When he asked Don McGahn to go back to the special counsel and change his testimony, that's obstruction of justice. That is immoral, that is criminal, that is defenseless, and that is condemnable.
So why didn't Mueller charge the president with obstruction and instead leave it up to Bill Barr to decide there was nothing to prosecute? Chaz.
Oh, God. Well, there's a simple answer, John. The Office of Legal Counsel says the criminal prosecution of a sitting president would impermissibly stop them performing their duties, and Mueller accepted the OLC's conclusion. So he basically said he would never charge the president. But could he just say that crimes were committed without charging Trump? No, because Mueller says you need to be able to respond to an accusation at a fair trial. And if Mueller said crimes were committed without charges, there'd be no way for Trump to clear his name. Well, how about secret charges that are sealed until after Trump's no longer president? Well, Mueller said it'd be tough to keep them secret, and if they did become public, that would also imperil the president's ability to govern. So Mueller was never going to accuse Trump of obstruction. He was either going to clear him or send the case off to Congress, because Mueller says that only Congress has the authority to stop a president's corrupt use of presidential authority. Congress, not Bill Barr. So, did Mueller clear Trump of obstruction? No way. Mueller said there was substantial evidence that Trump attempted to remove Mueller because of the investigation. He said that there was substantial evidence that Trump tried to get McGahn to lie in a memo to prevent further scrutiny of Trump's conduct by the investigation. And Mueller said there was substantial evidence that Trump's attempts to lean on Sessions were to prevent further scrutiny from the investigation. On the other hand, none of those attempts worked, did they? The investigation was fine, so who cares? Now, it's true that Mueller says Trump's efforts to influence the investigation were largely unsuccessful solely because the people who surrounded him declined to carry out his orders. But Trump didn't follow up on those orders, did he? He got a bit mad, he vented a bit, and then he moved on. So no harm, no foul? According to Republicans, maybe. But according to a case that Mueller cited, an obstruction of justice offence is complete when one corruptly endeavours to obstruct. The prosecution doesn't need to prove that justice was actually obstructed. Attempted obstruction counts. So, what do you think? Is that good enough for an impeachment? Because that is what Congress is working with.
OK, time we lawyered up once again, keeping you fit. John Sale was Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor, where he helped to obtain the Oval Office tapes that forced Richard Nixon's resignation. These days, he's one of America's leading white-collar defence attorneys. John Sale, thanks for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you.
So how significant are the concerns that Mueller expressed in his letter to Bill Barr on March 27th that became public this week, objecting to the way that Barr had characterised Mueller's findings?
Here's what I think everybody's missing. With all the attacks on Attorney General Barr, that when he released the report, the redactions were only 6% of the 400-plus pages. So why would he intentionally mischaracterize something when he knew that 2 days later the entire report would be released? And I've read it from cover to cover, the appendices, the footnotes, and there are countless reporters, trained analysts who've read it cover to cover. So why would he mischaracterize something if he knew 2 days later it would be released, the report itself would be released for the world to see?
Can we get your assessment of Mueller's findings on obstruction? Do you agree that were it not for that Department of Justice guideline against indicting a sitting president, that charges would have been laid against him?
The charge that Mueller had, and this is not my take on it, this is in our Code of Federal Regulations, which have the force of law. It said that the special counsel will provide a confidential report to the Attorney General. And all he's required to say in that report is reasons he would prosecute or reasons he would decline or not prosecute. And with regard to obstruction, he punted on that. He did not answer that question. So he left a lot of facts in there which could be interpreted either way. So I think the Attorney General who's being unfairly criticized in my mind, was given the task of having to make a judgment on whether or not there was sufficient evidence to prosecute the president on obstruction. And what I think Mueller could have and should have done is said, either there's insufficient evidence on obstruction, or there is sufficient evidence that he would be charged criminally, meaning the president, but because of Department of Justice policy, we can't actually prosecute him.
Would it, as Mueller suggests, been unfair, even untenable to declare that he would indict except for that DOJ guideline, leaving a president accused but unable to go to court to defend himself or perform the duties of office? Or would that have been a better thing for Mueller to have done, in your view?
I'm not an apologist for the president or for Mr. Barr, but let me say there's another Department of Justice policy that says if you're not going to charge for whatever reason, then you do not ruin somebody's reputation when they don't have an opportunity to come in and give their answer. So here, by punting or not opining on that, yet there are pages and pages of facts, including on obstruction, 10 separate instances where the president's reputation is called into great question, where he doesn't have an opportunity to answer it. So I think, as I said before, Mueller just should have said, I would have charged him, but I can't. And that would have fulfilled his job, and then the Congress will do what they're required to do, or they may do if they choose to.
So, as of today, how likely do you think impeachment proceedings against President Trump are?
Very unlikely, because although this did not happen in the Clinton impeachment, that as a practical matter, as long as the president maintains the support of the Republicans and the Republican leadership, he would not be convicted in the Senate. So what's the point? Now, I was a Watergate prosecutor, or an assistant Watergate prosecutor, and what caused President Nixon, he was not actually impeached because he resigned, but the impeachment was inevitable. But what caused his resignation was the Republican leadership went to the White House and said, Mr. President, we cannot support you anymore. So President Nixon lost the support of his own party. President Trump, it does not like that is not happening today, does not look like it's going to happen. So I think ultimately the approval or disapproval of President Trump and his actions will be decided in the 2020 election.
John Sale, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I don't know about impeachment, John, but some legal action is definitely happening. Apart from the Bill Barr shenanigans overnight, you've got Trump trying to stop his tax records getting out, Trump trying to stop his financial records getting out, Trump trying to keep Don McGahn quiet, Trump trying to keep Stephen Miller quiet. You've got the White House refusing or delaying document production for the House 30 times. You've got a half dozen officials not appearing before the House, and Trump is not done fighting with Congress yet.
We're fighting all the subpoenas. Look, these aren't like impartial people.
No kidding. Now, Congress can declare administration figures guilty of contempt. But then what? Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder was held in contempt and no one cared. Well, one, they could ask Bill Barr to enforce their contempt findings for them. Wouldn't hold my breath on that one. Two, they could take people to court, but that can take forever as well. When Congress found Bush's White House counsel Harriet Miers in contempt, it took 19 months just to get a procedural reading. And when the congressional session, and thus the contempt finding, expired, the case hadn't even been argued in court yet. Finally, you've got 3, inherent contempt, which allows the House to get their sergeant-at-arms to enforce their own contempt findings, resulting in actual imprisonment in the Capitol. Except that power hasn't been exercised since 1935.
It's time to do it again.
Don't think so. Pretty unlikely, John. But there is every chance that Trump could take a number of these subpoena battles past the 2020 election. So let's see just how frustrated the House gets.
Pretty frustrated, I think, but now...
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
And, of course, Chaz, the big election news was this.
Joe Biden jumping into the 2020 race for president with a stark and stunning video announcement. Images of white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, framing his vision of what's at stake in this election.
Biden's campaign video certainly took square aim at President Trump.
I believe history will look back on 4 years of this president and all he embraces as an aberrant moment in time. But if we give Donald Trump 8 years in the White House, he will forever and fundamentally alter the character of this nation.
And President Trump, who reportedly fears a Biden nomination the most of any of the Democrats because of his ability to win back white working-class voters, shot back at Biden on Twitter.
The media, fake news, is pushing Sleepy Joe hard. Funny, I'm only here because of Biden and Obama. They didn't do the job, and now you have Trump, who's getting it done big time.
OK, game on. Here's what you need to know about Joe Biden. He's 76 years old, a member of the Democratic Party. He served as Vice President under Barack Obama for 8 years, and before that was Senator from Delaware for 36 years. He ran unsuccessfully for president in 1988 and 2008 and decided against running in 2016. He's considered a foreign policy expert and worked closely with Congress to secure the passage of major Obama legislation, including the Affordable Care Act and the bailout of the auto industry. Biden's Senate record, though, could prove to be a problem. He was seen as lacking sympathy for Professor Anita Hill, who accused Judge Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment before he was confirmed to the Supreme Court in 1991. Biden had a reputation as being gaffe-prone, but dispelled that to an extent as Vice President. If elected, he would be 78 by the time of his swearing-in, the oldest ever first-term president by more than 8 years, Chaz.
Now, Biden's record holds a lot more concerns than just Anita Hill, though, John. You mentioned foreign policy. Well, there aren't many candidates who voted against the first Gulf War, but were right on board with the second Gulf War. You might recall Hillary had issues in 2016 with her previous support of the Clinton crime bill, but Biden wrote that bill. And as recently as 2008, he was still referring to it as the Biden crime law. Oh, and you know how we go on about how awful civil asset forfeiture is, where the cops take your stuff without even charging you with anything? Well, Biden wrote that bill too in 1983, which was 2 years after Biden voted to let states overturn Roe versus Wade. Now, that's a fun vote, although not as fun as his views in 1975, when he opposed racial desegregation in schools, and in 1973, when he came out with the immortal quote, "My gut reaction is that homosexuals are security risks, but I must admit I haven't given this much thought. I'll be darned." You know, I believe he hadn't given that much thought. Finally, John played Biden's announcement before, which referred to the Charlottesville protest. Well, only one candidate voted to give General Lee back his American citizenship posthumously, and that was Joe Biden. Now, to be fair, some of this is a function of just how old Joe Biden is. That vote for General Lee was a unanimous vote, for instance. And back when Biden was opposing school desegregation, he was joined by 79% of Democrats. Also back then, 78% of Democrats said homosexual relations were always wrong. So some of Biden's old positions might be explainable, but I'd love to hear him try.
Yeah, I think we are going to hear him too. Well, this week Joe Biden did hit the campaign trail, first to the state where he was born, Pennsylvania, a traditionally Democratic state which Trump flipped and where Biden will be headquartered, not coincidentally. Then it was on to Cedar Rapids in first to vote Iowa, where Biden was already sounding like the primary is basically over and it's down to him and President Trump.
Everybody knows who Donald Trump is. I want to make sure they know who we are, who I am. We choose hope over fear. We choose unity over division. We choose truth over lies. And we choose science over fiction.
Well, President Trump is certainly taking notice.
Welcome to the race, Sleepy Joe. I only hope you have the intelligence long enough to wage a successful primary campaign. It'll be nasty. You'll be dealing with people who truly have some very sick and demented ideas. But if you make it, I'll see you at the starting gate.
And by my count, that was one of 7 Trump tweets this week about Joe Biden. There are a dozen other retweets about Joe. Biden's apparent confidence in being the Democratic nominee is not without some justification, although it'll be more than a year until it's ultimately formalised. This week's Morning Consult poll, which straddled Biden's announcement date, shows the former VP surging 6 points to lead second place Bernie Sanders by 14 points. Elizabeth Warren has moved into third spot there. And another poll this week, this one from Quinnipiac, might be sending some shudders through the Sanders campaign. Bernie slipping 8 points into third. Biden leads second place Elizabeth Warren by a dominant 26 points, while Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, has hit double figures in a national poll for the first time ever, Chaz.
Yes, as you say, 8 months to go. Having said that, if we do look a little bit deeper into that Quinnipiac poll you just mentioned, John, there are even more concerns for Bernie Sanders. He's winning only 7% of the black vote, coming fifth in the field. That is not good for Sanders at all. And by the way, look at Biden up the top there, 42% of the black vote, and that's not a fluke. In CNN's latest poll, Biden's winning 50% of the black vote. Not to mention the old vote, Biden's winning 46% of the 50 to 64s and 50% of the over 65s. In pretty much every poll, Biden is dominating black people and old people, and there's a lot of them in the Democrats. Tell you who's going to be happy about that. The Stop Sanders Democrats, whoever they are. Apparently they've been holding secret Democratic dinners plotting to take Sanders down. And these dinners involve Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mayor Pete Buttigieg of all people, and lefty think tank chief and friend of the show, Neera Tanden. We should ask Neera why the Democratic establishment never seemed to learn.
Well, one of the issues dominating debate in the Democratic primary in the past 2 weeks has been a little unexpected. Whether or not prisoners, especially the worst of the worst, should be allowed to vote while still in jail.
I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. Yes, even for terrible people.
People who are convicted in prison, like the Boston Marathon bomber, on death row, people who are convicted of sexual assault, they should be able to vote?
I think we should have that conversation.
While incarcerated?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
So, a yes from Bernie, a maybe from Kamala, and a no from Mayor Pete. But the backdrop to this, Chaz, is, of course, the push to re-enfranchise ex-felons who in some states are prevented from voting for the rest of their life, something that disproportionately affects minorities, black men in particular.
Now, I know, John, that Kamala Harris said we should have that conversation about giving the Boston Marathon bomber the vote, but she must have had that conversation with her pollster, because the next day she was backing away something fierce.
Do I think that people who commit murder, people who are terrorists, should be deprived of their rights? Yeah, I do. I'm a prosecutor. I believe that in terms of there has to be serious consequence for the most extreme types of crimes.
And here's why she was backing away. 31% support for letting all prisoners vote, including 28% support from independents. Even Democrats are basically 50-50 on the question, although, like you implied before, John, black people do support the idea, 58 to 39. So maybe there is some method to Sanders' seeming madness. Something else from the last few weeks, all the major candidates have now handed in their taxes. So now we can see how much of their income these people give to charity. And it's pretty dire stuff. Lots of 1% donators there. I thought these guys didn't like the 1%. Although Elizabeth Warren is doing okay, donating 5.5% of her income. And what about Cory Booker donating 16% of his income? He's donated over $450,000 over the last 10 years. Very impressive. Certainly more impressive than Beto O'Rourke on 0.31% of his income. But don't worry, Beto had a great explanation for that.
But I'll tell you, I'm doing everything I can right now, spending this time with you, not with our kiddos, not back home in El Paso, because I want to sacrifice everything to make sure that we meet this moment of truth with everything that we've got.
Yes, Beto's donation is to give himself. What a guy!
Now, when it comes to vice presidents making it to the very top, history suggests that Joe Biden is probably facing an uphill battle. It was Franklin Roosevelt's Vice President, John Nance Garner, who grumbled that being VP wasn't worth a warm bucket of piss.
John N. Garner be nominated for Vice President
Garner, a conservative Texas Democrat, ran for president himself in 1932, lost the nomination to FDR, served 2 terms as his VP and stood for president again in 1940, only to see Roosevelt break with convention and win an unprecedented 3rd term, but not before dropping Garner from the ticket. No wonder he was unimpressed, but he wasn't the first or last VP to stumble at the final hurdle. Woodrow Wilson's second-in-command, Thomas Marshall, contested the Democrats' nomination in 1920, but was beaten by Ohio Governor James Cox. Republican Vice President Calvin Coolidge, though, did take the top job when President Warren Harding died in 1923.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves.
That approach worked with voters too. Silent Cal won the 1924 election and became president in his own right. When Coolidge decided not to run again in 1928, his Veep, Charles Dawes, wanted to keep his job but was dumped by the new nominee, Herbert Hoover. Hoover's VP, Charles Curtis, was dropped from the Republican ticket in 1932 and died before the next election. Jack Garner's successor as FDR's running mate and vice president, Henry Wallace, was a very progressive New Deal Democrat.
We know that this revolution cannot stop until freedom from want has been attained.
Wallace was popular, but just too liberal for some Southern Democrats who blocked his renomination in 1944, knowing Roosevelt's health was failing. So it was FDR's 3rd VP, Harry Truman, that took over when Roosevelt died in 1945.
Tragic fate has thrust upon us grave responsibilities. We must carry on.
Carry on he did, and, like Coolidge, Truman ran for re-election in his own right in 1948.
Open season on voters gets underway as the presidential candidates start cross-country vote hunting tours.
Truman beat the odds and the polls and won. 4 years later, though, he decided not to stand again. His VP, Alban Barkley, ran, but his heart problems, failing eyesight and advanced age, 74, put delegates off and the nomination went to Adlai Stevenson. But since the 1950s, Veeps have fared somewhat better.
I accept your nomination for President of the United States.
Eisenhower's Lieutenant Richard Nixon won the Republican nomination in 1960, lost narrowly that year to John F. Kennedy, but came back to win the White House in 1968. Meanwhile, Kennedy's VP, Lyndon Johnson, was sworn in following JFK's assassination in 1963, and LBJ won the presidency in his own right in 1964.
I choose not simply to run for president. I seek to lead a great nation.
Johnson's VP, Hubert Humphrey, who stood against both Johnson and Kennedy in 1960, was nominated by the Democrats in 1968 when LBJ decided not to run. Vice President Humphrey, though, lost to Nixon. He stood again in 1972 and lost the nomination to George McGovern. Nixon's first VP, Spiro Agnew, was renominated and re-elected in 1972 before resigning over a corruption scandal in 1973.
Raise your right hand, Mr. Ford, and place your hand on the Bible.
So it was Nixon's unelected second VP, Gerald Ford, who became president when Nixon resigned the following year over Watergate. But Ford couldn't quite win the presidency in his own right in 1976. That was also after his VP, Nelson Rockefeller, was dropped from the ticket in favour of Bob Dole. Jimmy Carter's VP, Walter Mondale, won the Democratic nomination in 1984 and made this unusual promise.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did.
Not surprisingly, Fritz Mondale lost the election to President Reagan in a landslide. In 1988, Reagan's 2-term VP, George Bush, won the Republican nomination and the presidency as well.
I thank all the people throughout America who have given us this great victory.
Bush's Vice President Dan Quayle sat out the 1996 election because of health problems. He hadn't done a lot for his reputation with gaffes like this either.
We all lived in this century. I didn't live in this century, but in this century's history.
Quayle did run for the Republican nomination in 2000, but dropped out as all the Bush support and money flowed to George W. Bill Clinton's two-term VP Al Gore won the Democratic nomination in 2000, but lost the presidency to the younger Bush. Bush's VP, Dick Cheney, never considered running himself in 2008, which brings us to Barack Obama's Vice President Joe Biden, who ran for president twice as a senator in 1988 and 2008, but didn't stand as an incumbent VP in 2016 after the death of one of his sons.
Unfortunately, I believe we're out of time, the time necessary to mount a winning campaign for the nomination.
So, what can we conclude from all of that? In the past century, leaving out Mike Pence, only 6 out of 20 vice presidents have become president, and only 2 of them first won the presidency in an election rather than being appointed, and both of them were Republicans, and none have been in the last 30 years. And that is all potentially bad news for Joe Biden in 2020. If the 2020 election is going to be a referendum on the state of the US economy, there have been some pretty encouraging signs for President Trump.
Just out, real GDP for first quarter grew 3.2% at an annual rate. This is far above expectations or projections. Importantly, inflation very low. Make America great again.
Although, Chaz, I do seem to recall one guy expecting and projecting much higher growth rates in 2017.
GDP getting up to 4, 5, and even 6%, because I think that's possible.
That wasn't Trump's greatest prediction, but 3.2% growth is still an excellent result, especially with a 3.5% hike in productivity. And if you look at GDP growth over the last decade or so, Trump's administration is starting to build a decent record over there, especially when you consider the point I made this time last year. Back to that growth graph, and we highlight all the first quarters. You can see there is a high point there, and there, but generally speaking, the first quarters are doing a lot worse than the other quarters. You see, they seasonally adjust these results to account for changes in weather or holidays or whatever, but apparently, despite the government's best efforts, the first quarter seasonal adjustment is a bit rubbish. So maybe they've cleaned up their seasonal adjustments, or maybe things are just going very well. Americans seem happy, at least, according to CNN. 71% say America's economy is in good shape, the highest share since 2001. So, yay, America!
And with that, we are right out of time. There's a whole heap more to talk about on the internet.
Yes, it's a Mueller Bill Barr fest in the Facebook Extra, so we'll see you on the Facebook page, the YouTube channel, or on iView. See you there.
Bye-bye.